Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's call on demystifying data intelligence, what it is, and why it matters. I would like to introduce our speakers, Emma McGrattan, CTO of Actian, and Matt Aslett, Research Director of ISG. Before we begin, I would like to mention again that this call is being recorded and you will receive a copy of the recording. Additionally, we welcome your questions and we'll try to answer as many as possible on the call. With that, I will turn it over to Emma.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. So, Matt, thanks for joining us today. So, for those not familiar with ISG, can you tell us a bit about ISG and about the buyer's guides?
Yeah, sure. Happy to, and yeah, thanks for having us on the
Of
webinar. It's a
course.
pleasure to be here. Yeah, for ISG is a obviously industry analyst firm. In particular, one thing perhaps people don't know is we actually influence over $200 billion of enterprise technology spending. So quite a
Wow,
significant,
really?
yeah, quite a significant influence. A lot of that is the core business is focused on service and technology providers and engaging with enterprises, advising the enterprises on their service and technology provider consumption. So the software research part of the business that obviously I'm part of forms comes under research and was actually acquired into ISG. Well, we come a couple 2.5 years ago now. So it's expanded into the software side, but the advisory, benchmarking, governance, and service provider part of the business is where the core sort of business is done. So our software research is covers two main areas. It's really sort of the underlying IT and technology platforms, analytics and data, AI, digital business, digital technology, and that's part of the team that I'm part of. And then the other side is all the applications that run on top of that. So customer experience, HCM, Office of Finance, Office of Revenue, and we've got our colleagues in the team that address that side of the software research of the software business as well. So in terms of the buyer's guides, obviously we will be talking more about the data intelligence buyer's guide, but our buyer's guides are really something that's been going on since the history of the software research business. So coming up actually just over 20 years.
Mm.
And it's there's a methodology that we've um, tweaked and obviously hopefully improved over those years. And we started, so it used to be known as the value index reports. Value index is still the methodology, but we rebranded those as buyer's guides about 3 years ago. Essentially what we're doing there as analysts and research directors, we're putting ourselves in the shoes of someone who's buying technology or looking to buy a particular software in a particular category. In this case, obviously data intelligence. And so we say, well, what would somebody who's looking for that software need to know? And so we obviously draw up a list of providers that we think are relevant that would be assessed as part of a sort of RFI RFP process. We draw up a list of all the functionality that we think should be addressed, and that includes not just the core capabilities of, in this case, data intelligence, but also things like reliability and availability, the user experience, and those are things that apply across all the categories of buyers guides that we do. And then in addition, we look at kind of the customer experience. So, if you're working with a provider, what kind of assistance do you have in terms of understanding the potential value or measuring the potential value of that investment? What's their onboarding process like? How do they, what's their support and services capabilities like? So, we assess all of those things. So essentially what we do is we send out the information to the providers. Some of them choose to participate and send information back. So some don't. Either way, we assess either their responses or whatever publicly available information we have, just like an enterprise would do if they were looking at providers they were looking to invest in. And we run through the questions. We give them a grade from A++ down to F. Each question has a score. You apply the grade, and you end up anyway with this matrix here, which is obviously the buyer's guide quadrant, and obviously the goal for a provider, I suppose, is to be in that top right, as you'd imagine, so which we call exemplary. And those are basically the providers that score the highest in terms of both the product experience and the customer experience. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell. And I'm sure that we can discuss more as we go through here. But that's essentially what we're doing, and we produced nearly 100 of these, I think, last year in various software segments.
Wow. Okay, so interesting. Thank you. So you're talking obviously to a lot of people, and I think top of mind for many people on the data side is data prep for AI. So what are you hearing from them when it comes to data prep for AI? And then kind of a follow-on from that is how do you define AI ready data?
Right. Yeah. So it's funny. We've been running for the last couple of years ISG AI events. And the first one we had actually was in the UK, and I was at that event, and it was quite funny because there was a lot of enthusiasm, obviously, around AI. Everyone talking about, their AI projects and getting running with their AI projects. And there was an element, actually, there was an element of being sort of that guy who's going, well, yeah, but don't forget about the data. Don't forget about data
Right. Yeah.
quality. Don't forget about data governance. And to be fair, it wasn't completely ignored by others, but it was what is sort of kind of fascinating in like the years since then. We're coming up to our event towards the end of last year. It was completely different. What everybody was talking about was the need to sort out their data management, their data governance, in order to accelerate AI projects. And I think there's been a lot of focus on that MIT study and failure rates, and I take that with a bit of a pinch of salt because obviously we're in an innovation stage. So there's going to projects are some of them are supposed to fail, right? So you can fail
Right.
fast
Yeah.
and move on to the next thing. But also, what we definitely have seen is, you see here the number one challenge that we see in this is from our data market lens study. Number one data challenge is getting that data usable for AI, and I think we've seen a lot of enterprises have realized in order to go from sort of a focused domain specific project proof of concept into something that's more substantial, particularly if it's across the enterprise, then they need to have their data, as you said, AI ready. And there's what the way I think about that is in terms of being AI ready is it needs to be clean and it needs to be well organized. And it needs to obviously be compliant with whatever regulations are relevant to that project, but also it needs to be kind of aligned to the specific business goals and objectives and KPIs of that project.
Right.
And I think that sometimes is kind of overlooked of like, well, we've got all this data, it's in a whatever lake house, whatever environment it is, and we can now make use of it for lots of different AI projects, and that is potentially true. But there is this need to understand the goals and the requirements and the KPIs, and then apply that to the data that is being accumulated and prepped and processed for that specific project. So yeah, there's lots of complexity involved in that. Obviously, one other thing we see is you know having good quality, clean, well processed data has always been an enterprise requirement. So all this is in some ways is doing is sort of shining a light on the problems that enterprises already knew they had, but have kind of maybe let's forget about that for a while because these are complex projects, but and problems. But I think if you are going to move ahead with a substantial AI initiative, then you have to address these challenges. Maybe not beforehand, but as you go through that process.
Yeah, good point. I mean, so we talk to customers all the time about data quality, and it's like, why is there a bigger lens over the whole data quality landscape today? And it's AI moving at machine speed, right? With analytics,
Yeah,
you had a
absolutely.
human in the loop, and they were like, yeah, those numbers aren't right, right? I know I did a big deal last week that's not reflected in the numbers here, so let's rerun the report. Whereas machines aren't going to be doing that for us. So yeah, it's a really
Yeah,
interesting time in
absolutely.
data. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and obviously, as you suggested, the at least the potential for agents to be making automated decisions really highlights that because, as you say, you no longer have the person with the domain knowledge to be able to spot. Hang on, that doesn't look right, or that's there's some difference there between the whatever dashboard I was looking at yesterday and what I'm looking at today, and
right.
yeah, so it absolutely needs to be in place to enable those kind of initiatives.
Awesome. So we obviously participated in your data intelligence buyer's guide, but for those who have joined us today that aren't familiar with the term data intelligence, can you shed a bit of light on that? What is data intelligence?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think, to begin with, I think, we just to illustrate that why we did this buyer's guide and why we think data intelligence is important. We believe a significant proportion, 3/4 of enterprise will be engaged in what we term data intelligence initiatives through the end of next year, and the reason we said that is about understanding how, when, and why data is used in the organization and by who. It's one of those things that I think organizations you think ought to have a handle on, but
Yeah.
very few do. In particular, the reason for that, I didn't know to build that out. There's multiple participants in relation to any kind of data project, and to simplify, we think about that in terms of data producers and data consumers, and they've got different requirements, and they've got different sort of perspectives on the data, and historically, all of these things were being addressed within the organizations, but historically with multiple tools that the data administration, the IT teams had to keep working together and integrate and keep in sync. And I think what we've seen is data intelligence as a sort of a product category, at least in the way we look at it, kind of emerged from data catalogs and the evolution of data governance in as platforms that can potentially serve that role of a single platform for addressing those multiple requirements. So we define data intelligence as software that provides specifically a holistic view of data, production and consumption that enables data administrators to understand and manage the use of data in BI and AI initiatives. And it enables them to then accelerate strategic data democratization initiatives to provide analysts and business users with governed self-service access to data across an enterprise. So there's a lot in there. There's a lot to unpack, but that's the way we view the market. And it is a term that I think we've seen a lot of not several providers have used over the years, and for a while actually I was kind of skeptical about it being a category because providers were coming from different places on the on
Right.
this map here. But actually, I think we have seen the market coalesce, and has become clearer that what capabilities are required to address all of these requirements. So yeah, hence why obviously we started using it because we identified, yeah, not only was it a category, but there was a very real need for it in a as a complement to investments in more traditional sort of products for data management, data integration, data quality, and data governance. Obviously, none of those things go away in and of themselves, but there's this broader data intelligence category.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a shift kind of from that modern data stack where you had point solutions, best of breed for various things, right? And people now anticipate that the intelligence platform should deliver all of it, right? And whether we build this out through partnerships or we build it ourselves, the expectation is that it's all integrated, right? That if you're
Yeah,
using something like a data product, that data contract behind the product has observability on it. It's making sure that they can trust the outcomes. If problems arise, you've got the ability to kind of hit a kill switch and say, okay, we need to fix the data pipelines. Until we do that, we can't continue with this initiative. But we definitely see
yeah.
from the Actian side that people love best of breed, but they kind of want it all to work together. And the easiest way of doing that is kind of coming to a single vendor with some good partnerships.
Yeah, there's definitely, it's funny how sort of the pendulum swings back and
Right?
forth. And,
Yeah.
mentioned the modern data stack. And I think, there was lots of good reasons why, obviously those products, a lot of those products emerged and and were adopted. But I think, we saw that as I use the phrase the modern data smorgasbord, because it was like, hey, here's like hundreds of things that you can choose from. But it's up to you to get them all to work
That's
together.
good. Right. Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think, obviously, all enterprises are concerned about lock-in and putting all their eggs in one basket. But definitely, I think the pendulum has swung towards, unification and having all these most of these capabilities provided by a single provider, particularly because they all do work together and they are all interreliant. And if you're stitching that together yourself and sort of, with duct tape and and hope, then at some point, particularly at large scale, that's going to cause you problems.
Yeah, particularly machine speed too, right? Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so we've kind of defined data intelligence now for the audience. So in terms of functional requirements for data intelligence, how is ISG thinking about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you can see obviously some of the key capabilities here in terms of obviously that governance layer and obviously security is going to be part of this absolutely. Data quality, and you mentioned data observability, and perhaps we can get onto this, but how those to some extent overlap, and I think part of what the reason why we've seen this drive is some of the existing tools, the traditional tools, as you were kind of alluded to in the question earlier, were sort of applying capabilities after the fact. Once you built the dashboard, run it through data quality, assure that it's up, it's of a high enough standard. Whereas data observability is very much about tracking the pipeline and ensuring, well, trying to ensure that those data quality challenges don't occur in the first place, and obviously being a lot more adaptive. Data lineage and understanding usage, where the data's come from, who's touched it, what they've done with it, how it's been used is obviously important. And then from the consumer side, obviously we saw a lot of focus on self-service data discovery of, again, as I said, sort of emerging from that catalog space. Related to quality observability is this issue of trust, and you mentioned data contracts is really important here in terms of understanding, not just understanding, but having this agreement about what the quality of that product will be and how it will be delivered, and understanding the nature of that data, because it's one thing to be able to search for self-service, on a self-service basis, search for data. It's another thing to actually understand what is that data, what does that and particularly in relation to data definitions within organizations, to understand what all that data means and what the business applications and objectives related to that data are. So here I just pulled out, so this is related to the buyer's guide. And so I mentioned earlier, we grade from A++ down to F. And so what we with some of these things, we picked out what are the proportion of providers that are scoring A- or above. So, the highest level. And you can see, obviously some of the key capabilities that we see in this space. Obviously, metadata extraction is pretty, it's pretty much, well, I was going to say table stakes. Obviously, there's a lot of differentiation in how you deliver that, but the fact that is a requirement is key. Natural language discovery for search-based access to data is another pretty widely adopted. And then obviously an emerging space is the sort of the knowledge graph capabilities that actually tie in. You mentioned data as a product, ties in very well to data as a product as well, in terms of providing that representation of the data and the relationships that are related to that data, and the definitions that provide that common understanding of the data. So, less well adopted by the providers we're assessing at this stage, but obviously, we do see it's a big area of focus for investment by either new providers in the space or some of the older ones that are, trying to catch up with some of the innovation that's happened in the last few years.
So obviously, data intelligence is definitely helping companies deploy their AI initiatives through to production. But there's also a role for AI in the delivery of data intelligence itself, right? So using AI for things like glossaries and natural language interfaces to the data and so on. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we do see. I mean, obviously, all software providers, well, almost all software providers are investing in AI capabilities. If they're not, they absolutely should be. And they're getting there. But yeah, as you said, data intelligence, in particular, sort of data management capabilities, are really ripe for acceleration using data, using Gen AI. And so, yeah, we believe that almost all data intelligence software providers definitely will be delivering support for those kind of capabilities, throughout next year. Yeah, as you mentioned, some of the key areas. identifying, classifying, maintaining, those maps of relationships, creating those knowledge graphs, um, automating the generation of data descriptions, summarizing data. Obviously, as always with Gen AI, you have to be wary of making sure that the output of the that's generated is correct and accurate. So, there are obviously those caveats, but there is certainly significant areas where a lot of acceleration can be done in terms of reducing the amount of really critically important but also mundane and time consuming
Right.
tasks.
Yes.
Right. Yeah,
Mind-numbingly tedious building out a
yes,
glossary, right? Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely, but hugely important, and
Yeah.
that has to be done. So
Right.
obviously anything that can accelerate that, I think, in this space, obviously we are genuinely looking at tasks that can be accelerated to enable those people to then focus on higher value tasks rather than replacing them. And
Yeah.
obviously, clearly, if you're, as you said, if you're doing generating data quality checks, if you're generating summaries of data, things like that, that has to be, checked by, there has to be a human in the loop to check that and qualify that so that the data can be trusted then by those that are finding it. But yeah, I mean, and again, so these again are percentages of providers that are scoring A minus or above. So it gives you an indication, even though, as I said, we anticipate that all providers of data intelligence software will be investing in these areas over the next couple of years. Some are further ahead than others. Yeah, so there's a lot of investment ongoing in this space. But it's definitely an area where I think we see agents as well can
Yeah.
deliver additional value in relation to automating some of these processes.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what we're doing, right? And no surprise. So yeah, okay, great. So now, yeah, we talked about earlier when you were defining data intelligence, right? We had the data producers and the data consumers. And, what I've seen a lot of successes in organizations where they're using data products, where they've defined a data side owner, I'm sorry, yeah, a data engineering side owner of the data product, right? And a business side owner. And that helps with consumption because the two teams have agreed on what it is that they're going to produce and what it looks like and what's
Right.
quality like and so on. And that kind of helps with adoption. So how are you seeing that? Are you
Yeah, no,
seeing
it's
this?
this. I mean,
Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, this is definitely one of those areas where there's, huge, room for improvement. And it's I think it's one of those areas where many organizations have wanted to improve that. They've known this has been a challenge that they to get these two groups of people within their organization to collaborate in order to improve the delivery of data and analytics initiatives. Um, well, I'm not going to go into the reasons why there are many reasons why that is difficult, and each organization is different. Each organization has different challenges with that. But I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen a lot of focus on data products. It's not it's not going to solve everything overnight. You have to adapt your business processes and your collaboration processes additionally to take advantage of the technology. But as you just described there, it focuses attention on defining the data inputs, the outputs, the assumptions, and the goals and the KPIs, and especially as you said, if you are building data contracts into that process, which we see, most organizations, most providers are in the process of delivering those capabilities to enable organizations to do that with data intelligence software. That really provides the focal point, and that focus of agreement within those two parties that gives the users the confidence that they can take advantage of that data that they find. They do understand what it's for, what the definitions are, and they can then accelerate their use of those data products.
Yeah, so I was at a conference recently and somebody came up to me after I'd done my keynote and they were asking, do I have to wait until I fix all of my quality issues before I implement governance? I'm like, oh God, you're never going to fix all your quality issues, right? There's going to be new sources
Yeah,
of
good luck
data,
with
new
that.
data coming in all the time. It's like, don't wait, right? But it's able to point them to this concept of data contracts and data products and say,
Yeah,
okay, let's identify one small project, show success with that, right? You don't have to boil the ocean, just like narrow the aperture down to one app, right? And let's look at quality for that one app. Let's deliver a product and let's deliver success. And that's how I love to think of data contracts and data products is kind of giving you the opportunity to show success because everybody is like, I think deluded by how quickly we're going to deliver production grade AI into the enterprise. And they're seeing so much success with it, the use of ChatGPT in their personal lives and making their emails look a lot smarter and so on, that they're expecting that the business experience is going to be similar. And it's going to take us some time
right.
to get there. So identifying where you can get some quick wins, I think, is important.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. And I think another aspect of that in relation to data products is the domain based focus of data products. And so you talked there about, quick win or, defining the scope within a particular business department or domain and identifying the KPIs around that. Obviously, with the goal of making the output or the outcome available to others within the organization, which is part of the whole point of the data product approach. But it does provide that focus, which I think is one of the reasons why everyone can have really good intentions about improving, as I said, sort of collaboration between data producers and consumers across the organization. If you try and do it across the entire organization, that's a huge project. If you can do it at a project at a time, focused on different domains, then yeah, it alleviates the process at the very least.
So, I mean, talking of domains, are you seeing a lot of federated governance being deployed where each department kind of has some level of autonomy around governance for their particular domain and bringing in, data nerds and data passionate people across the various domains in the enterprise? Yeah.
Data passionate people rather than data nerds. I don't, I don't
Let's say
yeah,
data curious is probably a better term for it, right?
okay,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, yes. What I think is interesting, so that's what getting so whether the sort of data product concept obviously emerged with data mesh, and we've seen less adoption of data mesh as a whole, but I think the data products concept and the domain based delivery of that, and as you said, federated governance is then obviously related to that.
Right.
You can adopt data. I think we see different organizations approaching it differently. Not everyone is going, hey, we're going all in data mesh, we're all in federated governance. It depends, obviously. We've done some interesting research last year around organizational approaches to data, whether that is distributed, the IT responsibility, is that distributed across different business units? Is it with centralized team? Is it a mixed model? And of course, as alluded to earlier, every organization is going to be slightly different. So I think lots of organizations are figuring out what approach works for them. But broadly speaking, yes, I think we're seeing more of the federated approach because there are some really good advantages that we've seen from that, particularly in relation to improving collaboration and accelerating the delivery of projects. But every organization, as I say, is different, and therefore their success with that is going to be predicated on many other factors rather than just adoption of technology and deciding, right, this is what we're going to do. You've got to actually, it's easier said than done. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, very true. All right, so we had a few questions submitted in advance of the webinar, and we've had a few questions submitted while we're online. So I'll take the first question here, and that is, has AI intensified the value of data intelligence over the past 12 months? And I mean, from my perspective, absolutely, right? Not only has it increased the value of data intelligence, but it also has exposed the cost of not having it, right? We talked earlier about how traditional BI didn't have to be perfect, right? So you had a human in the loop that could catch glaring errors, but for the most part, the answers you got were good enough to make decisions for the business. But with AI and the speed at which agents and LLMs are consuming data, you can't always have that human in the loop, right, to make sure that the data is of sufficient quality. So you have to use observability, data quality, and so on. So yes, to me, data intelligence has shifted from a nice to have to you absolutely have to have it. But Matt, from your vantage point at ISG, are you
Yeah.
seeing organizations moving from viewing data intelligence as a kind of a modernization initiative when it comes to data management to treating it as an absolutely foundational infrastructure for AI?
No, definitely. I think, as I said, we've seen many organizations not necessarily. Again, I go back to that MIT study. It's not like they're abandoning AI projects, but I think that you can do your proof of concept. Yeah, and we see companies doing this. Do the proof of concept, prove the value of AI initiatives on a small scale, but also recognizing if they're gonna take this out across the organization, if they're going to move from a couple of projects to 10, tens of projects, then they need to have a level of confidence in not just some of their data, but all of their data, and the investment in data intelligence and the capabilities we were talking about earlier is potentially a way of delivering that. Because just as you said there, driving some of those processes that were previously done after the creation of dashboards and reports or even AI projects to front load those in terms of observability and defining things like KPIs and data quality expectations up front. Because as you said, in terms of sort of the automation and the increased use of agents and the fact that there is some of these capabilities need to be guaranteed so they can have confidence to adopt those. But also in terms of if you're looking at large scale AI initiatives, then you're looking, depends obviously on the project, but you can assume data coming from multiple different data sources, multiple different, what might have been silos. And so you can't do that on a piecemeal project by project basis. You need to have a base layer of confidence in the majority of your data. Obviously, you're not going to use all your data every time, but yes, and so therefore, a lot more focus on data intelligence as a way of potentially achieving that.
So kind of a follow-on from that, Matt, and where are firms underestimating the operational risk of deploying AI without a governed metadata and semantic layer?
Oh,
This
numerous.
is a surprise question, right? Yes.
Well, obviously, I mean, I think it's interesting the concept of risk. I think one of the there are multiple reasons why there's a lot more focus. You think about there's a lot more C-level driven AI projects, and there's huge expectations, realistic or not, about what can be achieved using AI. So, the risk of that's more of an internal risk of failing to deliver what the board expects you to deliver is huge. Obviously, there's enormous potentially, regulatory risks and legal risks. There's huge potential ethical challenges what's the word? I'm missing the word. But in terms of the reputational risk if projects are not delivered well, one, if they're not delivered successfully, but two, could be they're delivered successfully but you haven't got the guardrails in place to control what the AI is
You
doing.
expose like a massive bias. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So yeah, the risks are many and numerous and absolutely, those are all things that are potentially have been existing risks in relation to projects. So the level of it is absolutely highlighted, is increased for each of them. And and especially I think what's a little bit different, you combine all those together when you're looking at at particular agentic and generative AI initiative. And yeah, so multiple parts to be governed, and hence why we've seen a lot greater focus on governance, not just data governance, but AI governance governing the models and all that stuff, and the combination of those two. Yeah, absolutely has to be addressed at the same time.
Thank you. So our next question submitted in advance. How do you balance data quality work with speed, especially if you're in an early stage environment? And it's a great question, right? Because early stage environments often think that governance is going to slow them down, right? But then the reality is a lack of governance is really going to slow you down later. And I think, when it comes to governance and quality, that 110-100 rule still applies, right? So I love to give the example of I moved to LA straight from graduating college in Ireland. And I went to get my driver's license, and I knew that in America they talk about weight in pounds, so I filled in my weight in pounds. But I assumed that if weight was pounds, the height was inches, right? So I'm 5'3", and I put in 63, right? And I got a license in the post, and it had me as 6'3", right? And I'm like, oh, that's kind of amusing. So I go out to the clubs, I showed my license, I was 6'3", didn't fix it. And then when I got a speeding ticket. I was driving out to Las Vegas, got a speeding ticket. And I think I could have talked my way out of it with the Irish charm and whatever, except that when he looked at the disparity between the height listed on the license and me in person, I got a ticket and then I had to get a lawyer, and it just became a really expensive thing. So I am living proof that 110-100 rule is something you need to look at, right? Fix these quality issues up front. All right, so we've been thinking about the fact that, like, if you are early stage and you don't want to get bogged down with governance, and you're thinking governance really as an enabler for innovation, right, and not something that's really going to be too burdensome, how do you think about minimum viable governance, and how do you put that in place so that it could scale?
I mean, yeah, and as you said, it's a really good question because it is a real,
Right.
it is a key challenge for organizations. And, yes, I mean, I completely agree with you that, governance is seen as a delay, but obviously bad governance and not failing to address governance is actually going to slow down more. But, so there is that balance. I do think, as I said, where we've seen this shift from data quality being something that's applied after the fact, after the data pipeline has reduced the report, then there's still a role for that. Obviously, clearly, you want to be assessing the quality of the output, but with data observability has shifted that towards the beginning of the process. And again, going back to data contracts, I think where you can really fairly rapidly define what the expectations are for a project right from the get-go. And so, then obviously there's more work to be done in terms of delivering on those expectations, but you can really quite quickly set a level through, data practice and data contracts of expectation. And I think, then, there's lots of really good, approaches, these days as well, in terms of not just traditional approaches to quality, which is, rules and data quality checks, but actually AI driven, assessments. And also, I know we've talked before about like trust scores, like, from a human perspective, the user's perspective, like, is this data of high quality? Yes, it may be of high quality. All the data's correct. Do I actually trust? Am I sure about this? This data. Are we sure about the source? Do we really know where it's come from and where it's been in between? And so the ability for, I think, the investment in, data lineage and data observability. Yes, there is an upfront investment there, and data contract capabilities, but that I think we do see that some of those capabilities can absolutely provide then the guardrails that can then enable you to go faster. And obviously, it doesn't have to be a all-in enormous sort of traditional data governance project from the start. But yeah, it is a really good question. It is a real key challenge.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real risk of over-engineering it, and then everybody tries to find ways around it, right? So, yeah.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
All right, next question. Oh, data contracts question. How do data contracts and federated catalogs ensure long-term data product quality? This is a great question, right? Because data products, degrade pretty much as soon as they're launched, right? Unless you have very clear ownership. And I talked earlier about like we recommend when there's a data product that you've got somebody on the data engineering team that owns it and somebody on the business side that owns it. So if something goes wrong, you know who to call and you know who owns this. And I think having that
Mm.
ownership really helps. But federated catalogs, right, helping with discoverability, helping with federated governance, right? Lineage, I think, is incredibly important. Policy enforcement is important. Understanding context. I mean, to us, context has never been more important. So getting the semantic there right is incredibly important. But to me, catalogs are a vehicle for operationalizing enforcement, and it kind of helps with ensuring that your data products don't wither on the vine, right? So,
Mm.
what guidance do you give to companies that are looking to deploy data products, and whether with or without data contracts, and to make sure that
Yeah.
it's an initiative that keeps moving forward and it's not kind of a catalog of dead, unowned products?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a really good question, and as you've sort of addressed there, obviously the challenge is to make the data products approach sort of fundamental to how you operate as a business, and actually operationalize some of the key processes that go to delivery of those data products, and obviously maintaining their freshness, ensuring that they it's not just a one and done, and they are continually updated. Because I think this is another part we haven't mentioned yet that is a key aspect of this, is that data is continually produced, and these products should be continually being updated, and that should be the information in relation to that should be available to consumers as they're searching for products, or even better, they should be alerted to that there's a new version of this data product, or obviously with where it makes sense to do so, and where they can sign up for that. But that's about sort of operationalizing and making it those ways of approaching data projects part of the way that you operate as a business, as you say, but both from the business side and the technology side, and that it does require, well, depending on the size and the age of the business, it potentially requires some real cultural change. And so,
Right.
and so what I mentioned earlier, this is to some potentially sort of easier said than done. But the other thing I think is, we think about data products. Part of what the reason we they're called data products is they should be the outcome of product thinking. They should be
Yes.
designed to be a product that the consumer wants
Yep.
first, and and has defined the expectations, as you said, in terms of the quality and the nature of the data and the quality of the data. But also, we think about how we consume and purchase product products today, the ability to say, yes, this is a good product, no, this is a bad product, yes, this, give a review 5 stars, whatever. I
Yeah.
think we see in some cases not all providers are building these into their their data intelligence layers, into their data product sort of consumption capabilities, because that is part of, it's obviously not the only thing, but it's part of keeping that fresh, and ensuring that if you as the consumer can go in and yeah, the data may be however old, but you can see that somebody used it yesterday and they approved it, and like, yes, this is still relevant, and yeah, and that's a business user rather than the technology user, oh, sorry, the technology team, that's part of it. But it's so it's about operationalizing all of those capabilities.
Yeah, and thinking of that product mindset, right? So it has a development lifecycle, right? And it has
Yeah.
a data product manager, right? So I think in more mature
Yes.
organizations, we're seeing that as a role that almost guarantees success, right? If somebody owns it, that their job is product management for data products, I think that that can help too. Is that what you're seeing in more mature organizations?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, as I said, it does require cultural change. So obviously, organizations that have been doing this for longer. I mean, I don't know how long has sort of the data mesh been. It's a good few years now, and obviously
It
companies
is,
that
yeah.
were early to that, have,
Yeah.
experimented. Obviously, I'm not saying every case has been, successful from the off, but they've found their way to what the processes that work for them and
Yeah.
implementing those. So yeah, more mature in terms of the adoption of data products, definitely, yeah.
All right. Our next question. This is an interesting one. I'm kind of not sure how to answer this one. What oversight is required for agentic AI networks versus single agent? So to me, this really is, governance has to evolve from just providing the model oversight. Now you're looking at a whole workflow, right? Because you've got those chain of agents and agent-to-agent interactions, and you've got agents that might be modifying context dynamically. I mean, this one is it's a huge orchestration of governance project, right? I'm not sure how to answer that one. How about you, Matt? What oversight is required for
Yes. Yeah,
agentic
the
AI
answer is yes.
networks?
Oversight is required. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're at the very early stages of I would what well the phrase I think was that agentic AI networks, but I think
Yeah,
but
yeah,
multi-agent applications or however you want to phrase it. I think we are seeing a lot of interest in agentic AI, obviously, and the development of agents. I think most of those at the moment are single, maybe not single task, but they're focused on a very specific domain, very specific set of tasks. They're really about automating perhaps existing processes, even if they're multiple task processes. Whereas I think the question is getting to actually, reaching across perhaps multiple applications, because obviously the other thing, as we see, is each of the big application providers is delivering their own agents and agentic capabilities. And so most organizations are looking at a future where they're going to have to, well, you can assume they will be requiring agents that operate across different software providers, across different, reach out to external, cloud services as well. And so I mean, well, this is such a huge topic. But yeah, I
yes.
mean, the governance is absolutely required for that. I think in terms of, and we're trying. So at the moment, we're in the process of putting together our next buyer's guide, which is on AI and data platforms. And obviously, within the AI platform space, we're looking particularly there at AI governance and AI operations and the ability to govern, all of those moving parts and monitor and be aware of all those moving parts within an agentic multi-agent process is currently, I would say, a really significant challenge for software providers and enterprises alike. But it's where clearly everyone is moving towards. So a little bit sort of watch this space. But yes, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's a huge challenge to, I think we can agree that that's where the market is moving.
Yeah.
How fast we'll get there, to your point earlier, how fast we'll get there, I'm not sure, because I think there's a lot of really significant challenges like that we're really only at the beginning of addressing. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. All right. So our last question for today, and it's a super simple one. I'm joking, it's huge, right? How do you set up a data governance strategy? Right. So how do you make sure that as you define your data governance strategy, that it doesn't just become a series of Confluence pages, but actually becomes a framework that gets
Yeah.
operationalized across engineering and business?
Yeah, nice easy one.
Yeah,
Firmly.
right?
I mean, we could do a whole nother webinar on that, right? But
We could.
I mean, I think that the thing that where do you I guess where do you how do you where do you start, I suppose, is the point here. If we're
Yeah,
assuming that we're talking about an organization that doesn't have one,
correct.
I think you need to start with, obviously, why are you implementing a data governance strategy? And there'll be multiple aspects of that. There'll be regulatory aspects, presumably. There'll be, as I said, earlier, there'll be risk related aspects. There'll be ethical aspects. There'll be all of those components. There'll be potentially business um, acceleration, requirements from from the business, from the SIP, from the board. So I think a key thing would be actually not to, if you're starting from scratch, not to dive straight in with what data do we have? What is it used for? How do we get that? But actually, what are your goals? And how are you going to measure whether you fulfill those goals? Um, and maybe I'll just stop there for now because I think that's where I would start, and then you can
Yeah,
go on.
the why, right? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. We have one of my colleagues here, she'll ask why 5 times, right? So it's like, why? But
right.
why? But why? Right? And until you really understand why are you doing it, right? That is probably a project that you should start. And one thing that's really
Right.
surprising to me is that sometimes, we'll go into a governance, what we think is an opportunity, and sometimes at the end of the POC, they'll decide that they actually want to do nothing because they see just how big an undertaking it is, right? And unless they can answer that question, why are we doing this? Maybe they don't do it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And because I mean, obviously, as you said earlier, I mean, governance, clearly is an ongoing process. You cannot
yeah,
be like, okay, we'll get here and then we'll have finished. But at
right.
least if you can define why you're doing it, you can then understand the metrics by which you will measure how well you are doing as you go on that ongoing, never-ending process.
So thanks so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it. I hope our
Oh, it's
audience
great.
enjoyed it also. It was very interactive. Loved that part of it. I'd love to invite our audience to visit Actian.com. You can download the buyer's guides. So we've got on our homepage today the ISG buyer's guide, and then a product tour for our data intelligence platform. But Matt, really appreciate the time that you took to explain this topic and talk us through it today. So thanks so much, and have a great rest of the
No,
day.
thank you. Great. Yeah. Thanks so.
Take care. Cheers.